There are betrayals that announce themselves with shouting, and then there are those meticulously orchestrated behind fake smiles. Tonight, when my younger sister rubbed her 3-month pregnant belly and announced the baby belonged to my fiancé, our 80 guests braced for a screaming match. They had no idea that instead of shattering a champagne glass, I was about to systematically dismantle their entire financial futures. Welcome to the art of absolute destruction by legal paperwork. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. I am Leah Gordon. I am 29 years old. The luxury penthouse located in the very heart of downtown Seattle cost me over $25,000 for a single evening of celebration. Every single cent of that exorbitant amount came directly from my own personal bank account. I am a lead data architect, a woman who believed that a solid future was something you built through hard work, logic, and meticulous planning, very much like a flawless algorithm. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the rental venue offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling city skyline. Outside, the city lights shimmered brilliantly against the glass, blurring into the persistent, freezing drizzle of the Pacific Northwest evening. Inside, however, the atmosphere was suffocatingly perfect. Waiters dressed in crisp white shirts and black ties glided silently across the polished marble floors. They expertly balanced heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported vintage champagne and delicate, overpriced canapés. The conditioned air was thick with the overwhelming, almost sickeningly sweet scent of hundreds of white orchids and the heavy designer perfumes worn by the attendees. It was a picture of absolute, undeniable luxury. It was a meticulously crafted illusion of happiness and success that I had financed 100%. There were exactly 80 guests mingling in the main hall. They were my professional colleagues, Marcus's supposed high-level business associates, and the wealthy high society friends my mother, Evelyn, had specifically and relentlessly insisted we invite to maintain her image. Marcus stood near the center of the room, looking devastatingly handsome and utterly confident in his custom-tailored charcoal suit. He played the role of the devoted, deeply in love fiancé beautifully, smiling warmly and raising his glass to anyone who caught his eye. But the true stars of the evening, at least in their own fiercely delusional minds, were my mother and my younger sister, Chloe. They moved through the dense crowd like displaced royalty, draped in sparkling designer gowns that I had, inevitably, ended up paying for after listening to weeks of emotional blackmail. I had always been the designated bank of this family. I was the reliable, invisible foundation they stood upon while they reached for the glamorous life they felt they deserved. I watched them from a quiet distance, feeling a strange, hollow disconnect between the extravagant, loud celebration around me and the cold reality of our parasitic family dynamic. The subtle, sophisticated hum of polite conversation came to a jarring, abrupt halt when the sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass echoed sharply through the vast room. Chloe stood proudly on the small elevated stage where the hired string quartet had been playing just moments before. She held a microphone tightly in one trembling hand, while her other hand rested gently, deliberately, and very protectively against the slight, barely visible curve of her stomach. Her large eyes were already brimming with perfectly timed, cinematic tears. The entire room fell into a dead, uncomfortable silence. "I know this is supposed to be a night of celebration for my sister," Chloe began, her voice quivering with a masterful, sickening blend of fake guilt and bold defiance. "But true love cannot be hidden, and neither can the beautiful life it creates." She took a deep, theatrical breath, letting a single, shining tear trace a path down her carefully contoured cheek. "I am 3 months pregnant, and the father is Marcus." The collective gasp from the 80 guests instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room, It was as if a bomb had been detonated in the middle of the Champagne Tower. I immediately looked at Marcus. The man I was supposed to marry in less than 6 months did not even have the courage to look at me. He stared intently at his polished leather shoes, his broad shoulders slumped forward, pathetically playing the role of a tragic victim who had been helplessly blinded by an uncontrollable passion. Before the immense shock could even fully settle over the whispering crowd, Evelyn rushed aggressively to the stage. My mother did not slap him. She did not yell at her younger daughter for ruining my life. Instead, she wrapped her arms tightly around Chloe in a fiercely protective, validating embrace. Evelyn then slowly turned her hardened gaze to me. Her smile was tight, completely devoid of any genuine maternal warmth. It was a socially acceptable mask hiding a grotesque, calculating reality. "Leah, please," Evelyn said loudly, her voice dripping with a venomous, commanding sweetness that demanded submission. "You must act like an adult for the sake of the family's honor. We have to handle this gracefully." All 80 guests collectively held their breath. They were waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They eagerly wanted the screaming, the crying, the dramatic, ugly collapse of the betrayed bride. The silence stretched out, feeling heavy and profoundly suffocating. Then, a sharp, metallic sound pierced the heavy quiet. It was the distinct, heavy thud of a solid wood cane striking the hard marble floor. From the shadowed, quietest corner of the room, my grandfather, Arthur, rose slowly from his wingback leather armchair. Arthur was a retired industrial tycoon, a terrifying man who had built massive corporate empires from cold steel and pure ruthlessness. He was the only person in this family, perhaps in the entire city, who saw right through the endless financial draining and the parasitic nature of Evelyn and Chloe. He did not curse at them. He did not raise his deep voice. The slow, rhythmic tapping of his cane was the only sound in the penthouse as he walked purposefully toward the center of the room. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He stopped directly in front of Marcus. The air around them seemed to instantly drop to freezing temperatures. Arthur looked straight into the terrified eyes of the coward who had just destroyed my engagement. "You just burned down the only lifeboat you will ever have in this life," Arthur stated. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the devastating, undeniable weight of an executioner's final judgment. Without sparing another glance at Evelyn's shocked face or Chloe's fake tears, my grandfather turned his broad back and walked steadily toward the private elevator. I stood frozen for only a fraction of a second. I did not shed a single tear. The cold, highly analytical part of my brain had already taken over the controls. I looked down at my left hand. I calmly slid the heavy, expensive diamond engagement ring off my finger and dropped it straight into my half-empty glass of vintage champagne. It sank quickly to the bottom with a quiet, final clink. I picked up my designer purse, turned my back on the pathetic, unfinished theatrical performance they had staged for me, and walked out right behind my grandfather, leaving the wreckage behind. I drove for 45 minutes straight into the dead quiet of the suburbs, leaving the chaotic city center and the wreckage of my staged engagement far behind in the rearview mirror. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a nondescript, completely anonymous motel situated right off the interstate highway. The room I rented for the night smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke, providing a stark, grounding contrast to the suffocating orchids and expensive designer perfumes I had just escaped. I sat heavily on the edge of the stiff, unyielding mattress, not even bothering to take off my damp winter coat. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted company laptop. As the lead data architect at Aetherist Dynamics, my machine was a veritable fortress of firewalls and security protocols. The erratic adrenaline that usually follows a deeply traumatic personal event had completely vanished from my bloodstream, replaced entirely by an icy, absolute focus. I was no longer a weeping, betrayed fiancé. I was a highly trained predator hunting for a digital scent. Most women placed in my humiliating position would immediately rush to freeze joint bank accounts or frantically cancel shared credit cards. However, My professional instinct screamed at me to look elsewhere. Marcus was a relentless corporate climber, a man who practically worshipped high social status and financial security. He was inherently selfish. He would never blow up his comfortable, carefully curated life for a secret, messy affair unless there was a massive, foolproof financial safety net already secured beneath him. I bypassed our trivial personal finances entirely and tunneled directly into my private development servers. This was the highly secure, isolated environment where I spent my late nights coding and refining advanced predictive artificial intelligence algorithms. It took me exactly 14 minutes of scanning the encrypted access logs to find the glaring anomaly. There was a ghost wandering through my machine. I traced the unauthorized data packets back to their source. Over the past 6 months, someone had been systematically and relentlessly siphoning my core source code. The method they used was painfully amateur, but it was devastatingly effective solely because it relied on my absolute, unquestioning trust. The security breach originated directly from the local internet protocol address of our shared downtown apartment. Marcus had been patiently waiting for me to fall asleep each night, logging onto our secure home network, and quietly cloning my entire life's work, data block by data block. I watched the transfer history cascade rapidly across my black screen in lines of glowing green text. It was not just a few isolated files. He had stolen the entire proprietary neural network architecture that I had built entirely from scratch over 3 agonizing years. I did not stop there. The theft of the code was just the weapon. I needed to understand his target. I utilized a hidden backdoor I had specifically designed for diagnostic purposes to force my way into his personal cloud storage accounts. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man was truly astounding. He had left everything sitting in plain sight, comfortably assuming I would be too stupid or too trusting to ever look. I discovered dozens of meticulously drafted emails sent to some of the most prominent venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Marcus was actively preparing to launch a brand new technology startup within the next 30 days. His attached pitch decks were beautifully designed, aggressively boasting about a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform that would change the market. It was my platform. He had simply slapped a sleek, minimalist new logo over my genius and boldly claimed it as his own invention. He was confidently asking for initial funding rounds in the tens of millions of dollars. Then, I dug into the attached financial documentation for his newly registered shell company, and my breath actually hitched in my throat. It was not out of sadness, but out of sheer, terrifying disbelief. The initial seed capital used to legally incorporate the business, retain high-powered corporate lawyers, and secure a long-term lease for a premium office space did not come from Marcus's savings. It came from Evelyn. I opened a scanned legal document and stared blankly at the digitized signatures. My own mother had secretly taken out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on our sprawling family estate. She had literally leveraged the very roof over her head to secretly fund Marcus. The scattered pieces of the puzzle snapped together with a cold, terrifying clarity. Evelyn genuinely believed Marcus was on the verge of becoming a tech billionaire. In her twisted, status-obsessed mind, she was essentially buying her favorite daughter, Chloe, a permanent, golden ticket to the elite class as a billionaire's pampered wife. The sudden, tearful pregnancy announcement at the party tonight was not a tragic accident born of uncontrollable, forbidden passion. It was a highly calculated, perfectly timed execution of a business strategy. Marcus had successfully extracted the final, crucial lines of my code just 72 hours ago. He had wrung my intellect completely dry. They desperately needed a socially unassailable reason to completely sever ties with me, while simultaneously making Marcus look like an honorable man trapped by duty to an unborn child, rather than a common intellectual property thief. What better way to discard the exhausted architect than to play the ultimate sympathy card of an unexpected pregnancy? They thought they had entirely outsmarted me. They firmly believed I would be too blinded by feminine heartbreak and humiliation to ever check the server access logs. They severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a deadly practiced rhythm. I immediately revoked all of his back-end network permissions, permanently locking down the core database with military-grade encryption keys. But I absolutely did not delete the stolen files he currently possessed on his local drives. That would alert him way too soon and ruin the trap. Instead, I quietly compiled a highly malicious payload, a custom-built Trojan horse virus. I silently injected this hidden, self-replicating code directly into the cloned architecture he had just stolen. From this exact second forward, I possessed total, completely undetected surveillance over his entire startup network. Every single email he sent, every keystroke he made, every financial projection he displayed to an eager investor would be silently mirrored directly back to my terminal. He thought he was walking away tonight with an empire. He did not realize I now held the digital remote detonator to his entire existence. The morning sun had barely breached the thick, gray fog rolling off the freezing waters of Puget Sound when my tires finally crunched against the crushed gravel driveway of my grandfather's isolated estate. The sprawling, fortress-like stone mansion sat entirely alone on a private island just 30 miles off the coast of Seattle, accessible only by a heavily guarded, wrought iron bridge. I parked my car near the towering oak front doors. I had not slept a single minute during the previous night. My mind was operating purely on cold, highly calculated vengeance, stripped entirely of any lingering sorrow. The heavy wooden doors were opened immediately by a silent attendant who guided me expertly through the echoing, dimly lit hallways. I was led directly into Arthur's private study located in the west wing of the estate. The massive room smelled intensely of aged leather, rare imported scotch, and the distinct, incredibly intimidating scent of immense, generational wealth. It was a space designed entirely to make visiting corporate executives feel exceptionally small and utterly powerless. My grandfather sat rigidly at the head of a massive, dark mahogany conference table. He was flanked by 3 men dressed in impeccably tailored, dark navy suits. They were his senior corporate attorneys, men who literally tore apart international conglomerates for a living. They did not smile when I entered. They did not offer any empty, polite condolences regarding my completely ruined engagement. We were not here to discuss trivial matters of the heart or broken promises. We were here to strictly discuss the absolute, systematic annihilation of a mutual enemy. "Sit down, Leah," Arthur commanded quietly, gesturing with one hand to the heavy leather chair immediately to his right. I sat down, placing my leather bag quietly on the polished floor beside my feet. Arthur steepled his wrinkled fingers together, his sharp, predatory eyes studying my perfectly calm demeanor with quiet approval. "Your mother and that pathetic coward of a man think they have executed a flawless, magnificent heist," Arthur began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that easily filled the quiet room. "They operated under a very specific, fatal assumption. Evelyn firmly believes that because you are simply an employee, a salaried data architect, you entirely lack the massive financial capital required to endure a brutal, grueling 5-year intellectual property lawsuit in federal court. They arrogantly assumed they could simply bury you in exorbitant legal fees until you ultimately surrendered everything." He leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth turning upward in a chilling, utterly ruthless smile. "What Evelyn and Marcus do not know, simply because they are fundamentally stupid people blinded by sudden greed, is the absolute legal origin of your artificial intelligence framework." Arthur gestured slightly to the oldest lawyer sitting on his left. The man smoothly slid a thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio across the smooth table directly toward me. I opened the heavy cover. Inside was an original patent filing, complete with the faded, officially embossed seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The legal document was dated exactly 20 years ago. "When you first began coding that predictive algorithm 3 years ago, you utilized a highly specific, foundational data routing protocol to successfully stabilize the neural network," Arthur explained, his tone completely devoid of any familial warmth, remaining purely transactional. "You innocently assumed it was standard open-source architecture. It was not. I personally developed and patented that exact proprietary protocol 2 decades ago during the early aggressive expansion of my telecommunications empire. It is an ironclad, legally indisputable patent. It is the absolute, foundational bedrock upon which your entire algorithm operates. I stared at the dense legal paperwork, the sheer magnitude of what he was saying hitting me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. Marcus had not just stolen my independent, unprotected work. He had unknowingly built his entire fraudulent corporate empire directly on top of restricted land owned by a ruthless, unforgiving industrial tycoon. Arthur reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my senior legal team has completely drafted the necessary transfer documents. I am officially and irrevocably signing over the complete ownership of that foundational patent directly to you. He signed his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes on 3 separate legal documents, then firmly pushed them toward my side of the table. You are no longer a wronged employee trying to fight a wealthy startup, Arthur stated firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. You are now the sole, undisputed legal owner of the exact framework his stolen software absolutely requires to function. Without this specific patent, his entire digital infrastructure instantly collapses into worthless, unusable code. The lawyers immediately presented the next phase of our strategy. They had already drafted a comprehensive federal injunction. It included a total and immediate asset freeze and a devastating copyright infringement claim, demanding tens of millions of dollars in punitive damages. The thick stack of paperwork was perfectly lethal, strongly resembling a legally sanctioned corporate assassination order. It was fully loaded and waiting for a single signature from me to be filed directly with the federal judge. I picked up the heavy gold pen, entirely ready to sign the injunction and aggressively burn Marcus to the ground before noon. But Arthur raised his hand, his palm facing me, stopping my movement instantly. No, Arthur commanded softly but with absolute authority. You do not fire the weapon today. I looked up, genuinely confused by his sudden demand for restraint. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound, terrifying patience settling over his weathered face. Right now, they are scrambling. They are desperately building their fake company with stolen money and stolen ideas. If you crush them today, they will simply declare bankruptcy, blame the chaotic market, and crawl away into the shadows with their pathetic lives and reputations mostly intact. He locked his sharp eyes with me, delivering the ultimate, defining lesson in corporate warfare. You must let them build it, Arthur instructed, his voice dropping to a cold, precise whisper. Let Marcus secure the massive funding rounds from the venture capitalists. Let Evelyn brag loudly to every wealthy fool in this city. Let Chloe buy the ridiculously expensive designer office furniture and blindly dream of her glorious, wealthy future. You let them fly as high as those fake wax wings will carry them. You wait until they have officially signed the investor contracts, until they are standing completely exposed under the absolute brightest spotlights, and only then do you pull the trigger. He picked up his heavy wooden cane, signaling the official end of the morning meeting. Enemies only hurt the most when they firmly believe they have finally touched the absolute peak of glory, Arthur whispered, a dark promise lingering in the air. Make sure the fall is entirely fatal. Leah. For the next 14 days, my phone vibrated constantly with a relentless barrage of texts and emails. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of Evelyn and Marcus was almost a masterpiece of human delusion. They were not satisfied with merely humiliating me. They wanted to completely erase me while stealing the very ground I walked on. Marcus demanded that I legally sign over the lease of my downtown luxury apartment to the newly happy couple. He claimed it was the least I could do to provide a stable environment for my unborn niece or nephew. Coupled with the ridiculous property demand was a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement drafted by his newly hired startup lawyers. Marcus aggressively threatened me in long, rambling voicemails. He warned that if I tried to cause any drama or speak ill of him within the tight-knit Seattle technology sector, He would use his imaginary high-level industry connections to completely ruin my professional reputation at Atheros Dynamics. He actually promised to have me fired before the end of the month if I did not sign his legally binding silence mandate. He even demanded a clause stating I would never attempt to lay claim to any of his future business successes. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt by a terrified thief trying to lock the door after robbing the vault. Following my grandfather Arthur's strict, strategic directive, I did not fight back. I suppressed every natural instinct to verbally destroy them. Instead, I carefully crafted my digital responses to project the exact image of a thoroughly broken, exhausted, and deeply depressed woman who simply wanted the nightmare to end. I texted them back late at night, intentionally making my messages sound desperate and defeated. "I just want peace," I typed out, my face completely expressionless as I sent the carefully staged text. "Bring the apartment transfer paperwork and the non-disclosure agreement. I will sign whatever you want so I can just move on with my life and forget you both exist." I scheduled our final handover meeting for the following Tuesday morning. I booked a private, high-end conference room situated on the top floor of a prominent corporate tower, right in the center of the financial district. I told them I wanted a neutral, professional environment to finalize the absolute severing of our lives. They eagerly agreed, smelling the sweet scent of total victory. While we waited for the meeting day to arrive, the two women in my family gleefully danced on my supposed grave. My hidden monitoring software allowed me to watch their every digital move. Chloe treated her social media profiles like a daily reality television broadcast of her newly stolen life. She posted endless, highly filtered photographs of herself standing inside a massive, empty commercial loft, aggressively bragging about personally selecting imported Italian leather chairs and custom mahogany desks for Marcus's brand new corporate headquarters. Her captions were sickeningly sweet, constantly referring to herself as the proud future mother of the next technology visionary. She was blindly spending tens of thousands of dollars of Evelyn's heavily borrowed mortgage money on decorative office plants, useless interior designers, and ridiculous corporate merchandise. Meanwhile, Evelyn was busy conducting her own desperate campaign of social climbing. She paraded through the exclusive country clubs and high society charity luncheons of the city, loudly broadcasting her twisted version of events to anyone who would listen. She smugly informed her wealthy peers that her brilliant future son-in-law was on the verge of taking the technology industry by storm, supposedly securing initial investments well over $20 million. She confidently declared that our family was about to ascend to a completely new echelon of the financial elite, casually dismissing my broken engagement as a minor, unfortunate bump on the road to their ultimate destiny. They were entirely drunk on their own fabricated success. They were cheerfully accelerating at top speed down a freshly paved runway, utterly blind to the fact that they were heading straight into a solid concrete wall that I had built, reinforced, and painted to look exactly like the open sky. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open exactly at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. The room was a soundproof glass box suspended high above the bustling city, completely isolated from the outside world. The air conditioning hummed faintly, keeping the temperature sharply cold, yet the psychological atmosphere instantly became suffocatingly tight the moment they walked in. Evelyn, Chloe, Marcus, and a slick, sharply dressed corporate attorney strutted into the confined space. They carried themselves with the sickening, inflated swagger of conquering generals returning from a flawless, bloodless war. Chloe immediately dropped into a plush leather chair, sighing loudly and resting a freshly manicured hand on her stomach, making sure her massive, newly purchased designer handbag was clearly visible on the table. Evelyn stood directly behind her daughter, projecting the aura of a fiercely victorious matriarch who had finally secured her royal dynasty. Marcus did not even bother to sit down. He stood tall at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, checking a heavy gold watch on his left wrist. He radiated an obnoxious, frantic energy, practically vibrating with the anticipation of his own imagined greatness. He aggressively tossed a thick stack of stapled legal documents onto the center of the highly polished wood. The papers slid perfectly across the smooth surface, stopping just a few inches away from my folded hands. "Let us make this quick, Leah," Marcus demanded, his voice thick with unearned authority and severe impatience. "I have a massive press conference scheduled in exactly 2 hours to officially announce the initial funding round for my new company. My investors are fully expecting me to secure over $15 million by noon today, so my schedule is incredibly tight. Just sign the apartment transfer and the non-disclosure agreement. You get to walk away quietly, and we never have to look at each other again." Evelyn leaned forward, placing her hands on the back of Chloe's chair, offering a condescending, sickeningly sweet smile. "Be reasonable, Leah. Marcus is being extremely generous by not pursuing legal action against you for your past erratic behavior. Sign the papers, go back to your little coding job, and let us build our future in peace." I did not reach for the expensive silver pen he had carelessly tossed on top of the contracts. I simply sat perfectly still at the head of the long table. My spine was perfectly straight. My breathing was completely regulated, and my face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. I was light years away from the emotionally shattered, defeated, and weeping woman they firmly believed they had been communicating with for the past 14 days. I slowly unclasped the twin brass locks of my heavy leather briefcase. Across the table, the sharp, calculating eyes of Marcus's hired attorney instantly narrowed. He shifted his weight uncomfortably in his expensive suit. A seasoned legal professional fundamentally knows the distinct, highly dangerous scent of an ambush, and the heavy, suffocating silence radiating from my end of the table was suddenly setting off massive internal alarms in his head. He leaned close to Marcus, nervously adjusting his silk tie, and whispered a rapid, urgent warning to his client. Marcus merely scoffed loudly, waving the experienced lawyer off with a highly dismissive flick of his hand. He looked at me with a toxic mixture of pity and severe annoyance, firmly believing my icy, silent demeanor was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate final attempt to salvage my shattered pride before inevitably surrendering to his superior intellect. "I am not signing a single page of your ridiculous demands, Marcus," I stated flatly. My voice was dangerously low, carrying absolutely no anger, only the chilling, clinical precision of an executioner reading a final verdict. Instead of taking his pen, I reached deeply into my open briefcase. I pulled out a separate, remarkably thick legal dossier and pushed it firmly down the center of the long table. It was heavy enough to make a solid, resonating thud against the dense wood. Resting perfectly visible on the very top page was the unmistakable, bright red embossed seal of the United States Federal Court. The opposing lawyer's face completely drained of all color the exact second his eyes recognized the federal insignia. He physically took a half step backward away from the table. Marcus stared blankly at the red seal, his arrogant brain severely struggling to comprehend the sudden, impossible deviation from his perfectly crafted script. Before he could formulate a single coherent word of protest, I calmly folded my hands back together on the table. "I told you I wanted a highly professional environment to finalize our absolute separation," I said, my eyes locking onto his suddenly confused, panicked face. "But a transaction of this incredible magnitude requires proper, official witnesses." I took the liberty of inviting a few additional guests to our little handover meeting. Right on cue, the heavy boardroom doors clicked open behind them. The triumphant, arrogant air in the room was instantly sucked out into the cold hallway. 3 men stepped decisively into the enclosed space. The first was my grandfather Arthur's ruthless lead corporate attorney, carrying a black leather portfolio like a loaded weapon. Right behind him were 2 towering, broad-shouldered men wearing plain, dark, unwrinkled suits. Their severe, unsmiling faces and the distinct, shining metallic badges securely clipped to their leather belts instantly identified them as special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attached to the Economic Crimes and Corporate Fraud Division. The heavy doors clicked firmly shut behind them, sealing the glass box tight. I remained seated as Arthur's lead attorney stepped up to the edge of the mahogany table. He reached over and flipped open the thick federal dossier I had placed there just moments before. The crisp sound of the heavy paper turning echoed loudly in the paralyzed, suffocating silence of the room. I looked directly at Marcus, whose previously arrogant posture had entirely dissolved into rigid, breathless panic. "What you are looking at, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing off the soundproof glass walls, "is a fully executed, federally mandated injunction. It officially details my absolute, uncontested ownership of the foundational patent your entire artificial intelligence architecture requires to function. You did not just steal my personal side project, you illegally built a fraudulent corporate entity on strictly protected, globally patented technology." The lead federal agent stepped forward, his expression completely blank and severely intimidating. "Marcus," the agent began, his deep voice carrying the absolute, crushing authority of the United States government, "we have spent the last 48 hours actively reviewing the investor pitch decks and financial projections you formally submitted across state lines to secure venture capital. Because your core product is legally classified as stolen intellectual property, every single financial promise you made to those venture capitalists constitutes criminal wire fraud and severe federal investor deception." Marcus opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. His face had turned the sickly color of wet ash. "Your newly formed startup is permanently suspended as of this exact second," I continued smoothly, showing zero mercy. "All associated bank accounts are currently being frozen by federal order. You are facing multiple, heavily penalized counts of corporate espionage and federal fraud. The maximum sentence for these combined charges is over 25 years in a federal penitentiary." The severe, undeniable reality of the situation suddenly slammed into Marcus's hired attorney. The slick lawyer abruptly stopped looking at his client and frantically stared at the two federal agents. He instantly realized he was standing in a sealed room holding legally binding contracts specifically designed to extort a federal witness and cover up a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate crime. The attorney aggressively shoved his scattered papers back into his expensive leather briefcase. He did not say a single word of defense. He simply turned his back on Marcus, practically sprinting toward the heavy boardroom doors, desperate to officially sever his legal representation before he became a named co-conspirator. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, sealing the three of them inside the trap. But I was not finished. A legal victory was merely paperwork. I wanted absolute, undeniable digital destruction. I calmly reached for the data cable resting in the center of the table and plugged it directly into my encrypted laptop. The massive digital projector screen mounted on the far wall hummed to life, bathing the dim room in a harsh, bright blue light. The screen instantly displayed the live back-end administrative dashboard of Marcus's newly rented cloud servers. It was the exact digital infrastructure he was planning to showcase to his wealthy investors in less than 2 hours. "When you sneakily cloned my hard drive in the middle of the night, you assumed I was blind," I said, my fingers resting lightly on my keyboard. "You failed to realize that an architect always knows the blueprints of her own building. I embedded a highly aggressive, deeply hidden Trojan virus directly into the stolen source code. It has been sitting quietly inside your servers, granting me total, unrestricted administrator access to everything you have built." Marcus lunged forward, his hands slamming desperately onto the polished wood table. "Leah, stop. Do not do this. We have millions of dollars on the line today. We can negotiate a massive payout for you." I looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. There is absolutely nothing left to negotiate. I firmly pressed the enter key. On the massive projector screen, a rapid sequence of stark red terminal commands began executing at lightning speed. The visual representation of his server storage capacity plummeted drastically. It dropped from 100% down to 50, then to 10, and finally hit absolute zero in a matter of seconds. I had just triggered a total, irreversible formatting protocol. Every single line of stolen code, every client database, every financial projection, and every meticulously crafted presentation file was permanently eradicated. I did not just lock him out. I completely vaporized his entire company, reducing it to a hollow, completely worthless digital shell right before his very eyes. The silence that followed was broken by a horrific, guttural sound of pure panic. Marcus grabbed his hair, completely losing his mind. He spun around aggressively and pointed a shaking finger directly at Chloe's face. "This is entirely your fault," Marcus screamed at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in ugly, desperate rage. "You never stopped complaining. You constantly pressured me for money. You demanded the luxury cars, the massive house, the designer clothes for this baby. You pushed me to launch before I was ready. You made me steal it so you could play the rich wife." Chloe shrank back into her chair, her fake confidence entirely shattered. She covered her face and began sobbing uncontrollably, not with graceful, cinematic tears, but with ugly, hyperventilating gasps of genuine terror. Evelyn suddenly let out a sharp, agonizing wail. The matriarch of the family realized the catastrophic, unfixable nature of the financial ruin unfolding in front of her. If the startup was completely seized and permanently shut down, Marcus had absolutely no income. If Marcus had no income, he could not repay the massive, high-interest seed capital. "My house," Evelyn choked out, her knees violently giving out beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the hard, carpeted floor, clutching the edge of the mahogany table for support. "The bank has the second mortgage. If this company is gone, the collateral is gone. They will take the family estate. I will be completely homeless with millions of dollars in debt. Leah, please, you cannot let them take my home." She was literally kneeling on the floor, her expensive designer dress wrinkled, crying hysterically for the daughter she had just spent weeks trying to destroy. Chloe grabbed my arm across the table, her fingernails digging into my suit jacket. "Leah, please, have some mercy. Look at me. I am going to have a child. You cannot send the father of my baby to federal prison. We are family." I slowly pulled my arm away from her frantic grip, standing up to my full height. I calmly adjusted the lapels of my tailored suit vest, buttoning it with slow, deliberate precision. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the downtown luxury apartment they had demanded, and tossed it carelessly onto the table. It landed right next to the thick federal dossier. "The house is yours," I said, my voice completely cold and devoid of any human sympathy. "But the debt belongs to the court." I picked up my leather briefcase, turned my back on them, and walked purposefully toward the exit. As the heavy boardroom doors closed smoothly behind me, I could hear the muffled, chaotic sounds of Marcus screaming curses at Chloe, and Evelyn sobbing hysterically on the floor. They were feral animals trapped in a cage of their own making, violently tearing each other apart in the smoldering wreckage they had so arrogantly created. 1 hour later, I stood alone on the expansive, glass-enclosed balcony of Aetherist Dynamics. The cold, sharp wind of the city whipped around me, but I felt incredibly warm. I looked down at the sprawling, busy streets of Seattle far below. I was no longer the reliable foundation for a family of parasites. I was the architect of my own absolute power. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face as I watched the tiny, insignificant cars moving below, possessing the quiet, unshakable calm of a ruler who had just successfully cleansed her kingdom of traitors. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.